All right, so today we're going to learn 3 words we should add to your vocabulary. This should be helpful to your skills whenever we are either answering some questions in AP Biology or pre-AP Biology. And for the first word that we are going to talk about is going to be predict. So when we hear the word predict, what's the first thing that comes up
The future.
in mind?
Yes.
Like predicting what's going to happen, like
You're like,
hypothesis.
Okay.
guessing.
You're like guessing? Okay.
Inferring.
Inferring, I like that, inferring. So, if we're going to predict, this is how I use it in context, okay? So, predict the outcome of the experiment. So, if this was a question, what is it asking?
What's going to happen? Like,
What's going to happen? Okay. So when do you predict? Are you just telling me, or are you going to explain as
you're
well?
going to explain like what you think.
Okay. So the definition of predict is, I'll put DEF for definition, is you will explain what you think will happen and prove using examples. So if you're going to answer the question properly when I ask you to predict the outcome, you're not just going to tell me the result. You're going to give me the result and then explain why. So let's say whenever we did the egg lab experiment, if we're going to predict the outcome of what the egg's going to happen whenever we put it in water, we shouldn't just say it's going to get bigger. What should we say?
So I believe that it will get bigger because I predict that it get bigger because of the water causing the egg to swell and its mass will increase.
Okay. So I predict that the egg's going to get bigger because the water is going to cause the egg to swell, therefore the mass will increase. Okay. Let's use some of the scientific terms that we've been thinking about. We've been learning about. Like hypotonic, hypertonic diffusion.
I predict that the egg will increase because the molecules in the water will make it hypertonic because it gets bigger.
Good. Okay. Exactly. So now you're not just telling me what's going to happen, but you're explaining. Okay. So other examples that you might use or you might see is that predict the effect of the transport proteins that carry amino acids into a cell if a cell stops working. Okay. So here's my question again, and it's got predict in it. Predict the effect of the transport proteins that carry amino acids, AA for short, into a cell stop working. Okay. Predict the effect of the transport if the proteins that carry amino acids into a cell stop working. All right, I forgot my head. So, predict. What does predict mean in this question?
What do you think's going to happen?
Right. What do you think is going to happen when what?
The transport. What do you think's going to happen? Like, what do you think the effect of the transport protein is going? What's it going to do when it carries amino acids into a cell to stop working?
Right. So how would you be able to answer this question now that we know what predict is? Well, let's think about transport proteins. We're talking about the nucleus. What's the process to make proteins? Where does it start out at?
It starts in the nucleolus.
In the nucleolus,
It
and
changes from DNA to RNA.
DNA to RNA,
And then it
and
goes to the ribosomes.
to the
Which
ribosomes.
is RNA is transferred into proteins.
Into proteins, right. And then the proteins will go where?
To the Golgi
To the
Golgi
Golgi apparatus.
and they'll get packaged.
Will they get packaged and
To
eventually
exit the
to exit the cell? Very good.
exit.
All right. So, predict. All right, predict. Next word that we will talk about will be mechanism. Okay? So when you see mechanism, what comes in mind?
Machine.
A machine, okay? When anything else?
Like a tool.
So
Like
tool.
a system.
Like a system, so a machine or system. In order for a machine or system to work, how does it work? Do you have one part or do you have multiple
Yeah,
parts
multiple
working
parts.
together?
It's like
Okay.
works, yeah.
Okay, so if I'm going to use it in context, here's an example. Propose a mechanism that explains the relationship of a eukaryotic cell and its mitochondria. So propose a mechanism that explains the relationship of a eukaryotic cell and its mitochondria. All right, so the definition that we would use right here in mechanism for this example would be the outcome of natural phenomena. We already talked about phenomenon, right? And phenomenon is what?
Phenomena is something that you observe.
Something
that
that what?
Something that happens, like you observe that goes on.
That happens in
Yeah.
nature. Great. Right. So the outcome of a natural phenomenon, or we can also say is what we see in nature. So there was a hypothesis or a theory when we were talking about the relationship of a eukaryotic cell and its mitochondria. And the mechanism would be what? Do we remember? It's some sort of relationship. Starts with the S. A symbiotic relationship, right? And it's also one of the cell theories, which was the third one. And the third one states what?
All cells are made from
pre-existing.
All cells come from pre-existing cells. And it was one of the hypothesis theory that was the endosymbiotic theory, right? That at one point, the prokaryotic cells were able to come together in a symbiotic relationship where eventually arose a what type of cell? A eukaryotic cell. Okay. Another example where we might see mechanisms being used is the diffusion mechanism explains why the eggs mass increase. The diffusion mechanism explains why the eggs mass increase. So whenever we're using mechanism right here, what is it talking about? What diffusion mechanism?
The process
all
of
the liquids
the
and stuff work together.
That's
to make
right.
mass increase.
Okay, so what's that process? What do we see in nature? What's the term of diffusion? What's the process?
It's going from the area of high concentration to the area of low concentration.
Exactly. So we will see in nature that particles will move from an area of a high concentration to an area of low concentration. Right. So diffusion. Okay. And the last term that we will talk about today is synthesize. Synthesize, all right, kind of like synthesis.
That's what I was thinking.
Stop. Synthesize. So when we talk about synthesize, what does that mean? What comes in mind?
Question.
Photosynthesis, an example, okay? What else?
I have
Something
something
that
that
is
but I
in
don't know how to
sync.
explain it.
Something that is in sync, okay? Synthesize, so like photosynthesis, okay? Well, let me use it in context. The ribosomes synthesize proteins.
Make
So it's
proteins,
like-
whatever you make.
So the process of making something, okay. So
Or
So they make them like bigger?
the context is the ribosomes synthesize proteins. Okay, so do we have a better idea of what synthesize might mean?
They make them.
Okay, so it does have to do with the process, and it also has to, you're also making something. That's twice, third time, I'm writing you up. Okay, the ribosome synthesize proteins. The definition that we use is to make something by combining different things. Okay. So when we're using synthesize, do we see how this term fits in with the ribosome synthesize proteins?
Yes.
Okay. The ribosomes are combining different things in order to make proteins, and what are those different things?
RNA.
RNA, okay.
I do
Yes,
not
ma'am.
understand.
What's that?
I do not understand.
Do not understand what part?
Like, I don't know. Just keep it out.
Okay, synthesize. Let's start over. The ribosomes synthesize protein, kind of like
They make
synthesis. They're making, right. The ribosomes are making the proteins.
But how?
How? The ribosomes make proteins by combining different things. So when we talked about, they use RNA, right? And the RNA is then translated into amino acids. And then the amino acids are combined to polypeptide chains, where eventually they become protein. Okay, so they're combining different things or different process to make something new. So synthesize. So if we're gonna say photosynthesis, plants synthesize food through the light that they get from the sun. So they use the energy from the sun in order to make food. So they're combining energy from the sun, and what else do they need? What do we breathe out?
Carbon dioxide.
Carbon dioxide. So they combine the sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water in order to make carbohydrates. Okay. Another example is the bacteria synthesize renewable fuel. So synthesize, what does it mean right here in this context?
They combine.
Translate it, renewable fuel.
So they like.
To make it into something else, to replicate it.
They replicate to make what? No, to make renewable fuel. So synthesize, they are synthesizing or making renewable fuel. So what might be an example of renewable fuel, if you know? You might know or you might not. Methane might be one, okay? Natural gases, like propane. Coal, maybe some sort of carbon fuel. What about those fancy cars, hydrogen cars? Okay, and the last example I want to talk about is whenever, have you ever heard of synthesis questions? All right, so an example of a synthesis question is whenever you're using two different ideas that you need to know in order to explain your answer. So, give me a
Okay,
second.
you're gonna combine. Synthesizing
So, there was a question in your last exam that we had. It was sort of a synthesis question because you needed two parts in order to answer it correct. And the first part was protein synthesis requires the use of mRNA. All right, that's the first part. And the answer was, it is translated by the ribosomes into amino acid sequences of the proteins. All right. The protein synthesis requires the use of mRNA, which, so the first part, what did he need to know in order to answer this answer correctly? What did he need to know?
How protein
What is
made?
protein synthesis?
What is protein synthesis, and what was that, Logan?
How proteins are made.
And how proteins are made, right. So then you are given several choices. The first choice is it translated by the ribosomes into the amino acid sequence of proteins, or does it carry the message to the nucleus to synthesize new DNA during cell division, or is it made in the nucleolus? And the last choice must be made by the ribosomes. Okay, we know that they're made by the ribosomes, right? So we can cancel out two of the choices, which is B and C. And now we're left with A, which is translated by the ribosomes into the amino acid sequence of proteins. And we're also left with D, which says must be made by the ribosomes, okay? So we gotta take a step, an extra step, or an extra step forward. In order to figure out which one's the most correct answer, what else do we need to know?
What?
How the ribosomes make proteins, right? So your correct answer would be A. It's translated by the ribosomes into the amino acid sequence to make proteins. So you're combining two things. You're combining two things in order to answer the question correctly. So that's synthesis or synthesize. All right, very good.